You are nothing, less than nothing. You are a whisper of a boy, torn from a world you understood, a world of sun-baked earth and the scent of your mother's cooking, and thrust into this cold, silent universe of polished marble and suffocating perfume. The air in the Topkapi Palace is thick, heavy with the unsaid, with the cloying sweetness of jasmine incense and the faint, metallic tang of fear. You are an icy Oglin, a page of the interior, but the words mean nothing to you yet. They're just sounds that hang in the air like the silk banners overhead, beautiful and utterly alien. The man who leads you, a towering eunuch whose face is a mask of impassive flesh, has a grip on your arm like an iron shackle. His fingers are cool, dry, and possess a strength that speaks of 1,000 similar journeys, 1,000 boys just like you, led down these same echoing corridors toward a fate they cannot comprehend. You try to keep your eyes down, fixed on the intricate patterns of the Iznik tiles under your bare feet, but they betray you, darting around, trying to drink in the terrifying splendor. Gilded screens flicker with the light of 100 oil lamps, casting long, dancing shadows that writhe like living things. You see other boys, older boys, dressed in fine silks, their faces pale and serious. They move with a grace that seems unnatural, a silent, gliding motion that makes no sound. They do not look at you. To look at you would be to acknowledge their own beginning, a memory they have been trained to bury. Your heart hammers against your ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. This is not a home. It is a machine, and you are its newest, smallest cog. The eunuch stops before a pair of immense, inlaid doors. He does not knock. He simply stands, and after a moment that stretches into an eternity, they swing inward, opened by hands you cannot see. The room beyond is a cavern of opulence, draped in velvets the color of dried blood and gold that glams in the lamplight. And there, reclining on a mountain of cushions, is a man. You know, instinctively, that this is the center of the universe, the sun around which this entire cold, glittering galaxy revolves. The Sultan. He does not look at you either, not first. His gaze is distant, fixed on a jeweled cup in his hand. The silence is a physical weight, pressing down on you, crushing the air from your lungs. Then his eyes move. They are dark, ancient, and filled with a weariness that frightens you more than any anger could. They slide over you, from your shorn head to your calloused feet, not as a man looks at a child, but as a connoisseur inspects a piece of porcelain or a breeder examines a horse. It is a gaze of appraisal, of ownership. In that moment, the last vestiges of the boy you were, the boy from the sun-baked village, begin to dissolve. You are being unmade and remade simultaneously, shaped by the pressure of this silence, this opulence, this absolute and terrifying power. You are no longer a son. You are a vessel. You are an instrument. You are a beautiful, empty thing, brought here to be filled with loyalty, with knowledge, with music, and with secrets so dark they will curdle your soul. This gilded cage is to be your entire world, and its price of entry is everything you once were. You are an object of desire and a tool of the state, and from this day forward, your life will be a performance, your survival dependent on the pleasure you give to the men who own you. The ghost of your name dies on your lips, unspoken. Here, you'll be given a new one. The story of that boy, a composite of thousands of real lives swallowed by the machinery of empire, is not a footnote of history. It is a central, pulsating artery, pumping a dark lifeblood through the heart of one of the world's most powerful and sophisticated civilizations. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire, a beacon of military might, artistic achievement, and administrative genius, harbored a deeply entrenched and institutionalized system of sexual exploitation and human commodification, targeting young boys. These were not isolated incidents of abuse, not the sordid secrets of a few degenerate elites. They were structured, state-sanctioned systems, woven into the very fabric of imperial power and social life. The boy in the palace was an icy Oglin, a product of a notorious Divserm levy, a human tax paid in Christian children, who were taken to the capital, converted to Islam, and trained in the elite Inderun Palace School to become the empire's most loyal servants. His parallel in the public sphere was the Cossack, the boy dancer, whose effeminate beauty and suggestive performances were a staple of taverns, coffee houses, and private celebrations. Though one served in the silent, gilded corridors of power, and the other gyrated in the boisterous, smoke-filled world of public entertainment, they were two sides of the same debased coin, minted by a society that simultaneously criminalized homosexual acts while ardently aestheticizing and consuming pederastic desire. This is the history that is rarely taught, the uncomfortable truth that lies behind the grand tapestries of sultans and sieges. It is the story of how an empire built a class of loyal administrators on the foundations of broken childhoods, and how its society's most celebrated form of entertainment was a spectacle of youthful degradation. We are about to delve into the hidden world of the ICO Glamler and the Cossackler to uncover the mechanisms of their procurement, the brutal realities of their training, the psychological torment they endured, and the desperate ways in which they sought to resist or simply survive. If you appreciate the exploration of these forgotten stories and the unearthing of history's more challenging truths, please consider taking a moment to support the channel by hitting that like button and subscribing for more journeys into the darkest chapters of our past. And to create a sense of the global community we're building here, please leave a comment below letting us know where in the world you're listening from. It is a powerful reminder that through modern technology, we can all gather together from across the globe to bear witness to the stories that must not be forgotten. To truly comprehend the grotesque verisimilitude of these practices, one must first dismantle the modern assumption that a society's public laws directly reflect its private morality. The Ottoman Empire was, in principle, governed by Islamic Sharia law, which, like other Abrahamic legal traditions, explicitly forbade homosexual acts. The Quranic story of Lot and the destruction of Sodom served as a clear theological prohibition, and judicial opinions from various schools of Islamic jurisprudence prescribe punishments ranging from lashing to death for those found guilty of such transgressions. On paper, the empire was a place of stern moral rectitude, yet the reality that unfolded in its literature, its art, and its social customs was profoundly, almost schizophrenically different. A vast and celebrated body of Ottoman poetry, from the high courtly verse of masters like Baki and Fuseli to the more colloquial songs sung in taverns, was saturated with homoerotic and pederastic themes. The object of this poetic desire was almost invariably a beautiful young man or boy, the Mabub, whose cruel indifference, downy-cheeked beauty, and tyrannical hold over the poet's heart were central tropes. This was not a subversive, underground literature. It was the mainstream, the celebrated pinnacle of artistic expression, patronized by the very sultans, viziers, and religious scholars who were the custodians of Sharia law. This gaping chasm between legal prescription and cultural celebration created a space of profound hypocrisy, a societal gray zone where desire for boys could be publicly expressed and aestheticized, so long as it remained cloaked in the sophisticated language of poetic metaphor and did not result in a public legal complaint. This cultural climate provided the fertile soil in which the institutions of the IC Oghlan and the Cossack could flourish, not as aberrations, but as logical, if extreme, manifestations of the society's bifurcated soul. The systemic foundation for the IC Oghlamler was even more concrete, rooted in one of the most unique and ruthless instruments of Ottoman statecraft, the divserm. The divserm, or child levy, was a human tax imposed on the Christian communities of the Balkans. Periodically, Ottoman officials would descend upon villages in regions like Albania, Greece, and Serbia and forcibly recruit a quota of the best and brightest young boys, typically between the ages of 8 and 18. This was a calculated act of social engineering on a breathtaking scale. The boys were severed from their families, their faith, and their native tongues forever. They were brought to Constantinople, surgically converted to Islam, and subjected to a rigorous process of selection and training. The most physically imposing were destined for the elite Janissary Corps, the Sultan's fearsome slave soldiers. The most intelligent and handsome, however, were chosen for a more rarefied and psychologically demanding path. They were selected for the Enderun, the palace school located deep within the most private, third courtyard of the Topkapi Palace. This institution was the crucible of the Ottoman ruling class. Its purpose was to create a cadre of administrators, governors, and military commanders who owed their allegiance to one person and one person alone, the Sultan. By erasing their past and making their entire existence, from their religion to their future prospects, a gift from the sovereign, the system aimed to forge a class of men immune to the corrupting influences of regional loyalties and powerful Turkish families. They were, in the most literal sense, the Sultan's slaves, and their absolute dependency was the bedrock of their utility. Within this hermetically sealed environment, the normal rules of society did not apply. The Enderun was a world of men and boys, entirely cut off from female contact. The boys' youth and beauty became a form of currency, and their sexual submission to older pages, to palace eunuchs, and ultimately to the Sultan himself was an unspoken but integral part of their education in power, submission, and patronage. It was a pathological system that conflated servitude with education and loyalty with sexual subjugation, creating men who were both supremely capable and deeply scarred, ready to be unleashed upon the empire they were born to rule, perpetuating the very system that had unmade them. If the Oglin was a creature of the state's cold, calculating logic, the Cossack was a product of its feverish, public appetite. The Cossack dance tradition was not unique to the Ottomans, having roots in Middle Eastern and Central Asian cultures, but it reached its zenith in the vibrant, chaotic social melting pots of Constantinople, Smyrna, and Salonika. Cossack troops, known as Kol, were professional organizations, often dominated by specific ethnic groups, particularly Roma, Greeks, and Armenians. The leader of the troop, the Kalbasi, was a shrewd businessman and a demanding taskmaster. His primary assets were the boys he recruited. These boys, typically starting between the ages of 7 and 12, were chosen for their delicate, feminine features, their physical grace, and their perceived lack of inhibition. Many were sold into the life by desperately poor families, seeing it as the only alternative to starvation. Others were orphans scooped up from the streets, or were perhaps even the sons of former Cossacks, born into the profession. Their lives became a relentless cycle of training. They were taught to master the complex, sinuous movements of a dance, a physically demanding art form that involved intricate footwork, undulating torsos, and the percussive clicking of brass finger cymbals called karper. But their education went far beyond choreography. They were taught how to use their bodies, not just as instruments of dance, but as objects of seduction. They grew their hair long, weaving it with pearls and ribbons. They wore elaborate, often feminized costumes, richly embroidered velvet jackets, wide silken sashes, and baggy trousers. Their faces were painted with kohl and rouge, transforming them into living dolls, androgynous beings designed to provoke desire in their male patrons. The system was one of open commodification. The Cossacks performed in mayhanes, taverns, coffee houses, and at private parties hosted by the wealthy elite, including the janissaries, who were their most notorious and fervent patrons. The patrons would drink heavily, showering the favored dancers with coins, competing with one another for their attention. The dancing was merely the prelude, the public advertisement. The unwritten but universally understood contract was that the boys were available for sexual hire after the performance. The Kalbasi acted as both manager and pimp, negotiating the price and taking a significant cut. For the Cossack, there was no distinction between art and abuse. The performance and the violation were part of the same transaction, the same grim reality of their existence. The process of procurement for these two distinct but related systems reveals the empire's dual methods of consumption, one clinical and state-driven, the other messy and market-driven. For the future Oglin, the moment of acquisition was one of state-sanctioned terror. Imagine the scene, repeated for centuries in countless Balkan villages. The arrival of the Ottoman official, the Turnus or chief crane keeper, whose title belied his grim purpose. The village elders would be forced to assemble all the boys of the prescribed age. The Christian parents would watch, hearts frozen with a dread that was both familiar and immediate, a generational trauma passed down in hushed warnings. The selection was methodical, almost veterinary. Boys were checked for physical perfection, a strong constitution, and signs of intelligence. There could be no blemishes, no hernias, no visible defects. The official would walk the lines of terrified children, pointing, choosing. A scribe would record the name, the village, the parentage, the last time that identity would hold any official meaning. The desperation of parents was boundless. Some would try to hide their sons, to marry them off at an impossibly young age, or even, in the most extreme cases, to mutilate them slightly to render them ineligible. But resistance was often futile and carried the risk of brutal punishment. The chosen boys were then chained or roped together and marched away, a mournful procession leaving behind a village hollowed out by grief. The journey to Constantinople was a brutal filter. The weak, the sick, or the rebellious might not survive. It was the first stage of their unmaking, a long, painful severance from everything they had ever known, a forced march toward a future they could not imagine. This was not a back-alley transaction. This was imperial policy, a cold, bureaucratic harvest of human souls, justified by the state's insatiable need for loyal, rootless servants. For the Cossack, procurement was a transaction rooted in poverty and desperation. There were no imperial officials, only the keen, predatory eye of the Kalbasi. These troop leaders were fixtures in the poorer quarters of the empire's great cities. They knew where to find vulnerability. They would scout neighborhoods, looking for boys with the right look, the effeminate grace, the large, dark eyes, the yet unbroken voice. They would approach families crippled by debt or famine, offering a sum of money that, to a parent watching their other children starve, must have seemed like a lifeline from God. They would frame the transaction not as a sale into sexual slavery, but as an apprenticeship. The boy would be fed, clothed, and taught a valuable skill, a trade. He would bring honor, and more importantly, income back to the family. It was a lie wrapped in the comforting language of opportunity, a lie that desperate people were willing or forced to believe. In other cases, the troop itself was a family affair, a grim inheritance passed from one generation to the next. A former Cossack, his own youth and marketability faded, might train his own sons or nephews, seeing it as the only life he knew how to provide. Orphanages and the streets were also fertile hunting grounds. A lonely, hungry boy could easily be lured by the promise of food, shelter, and the glamour of the troop, a world of colorful costumes and exciting music that seemed a universe away from his current misery. He would not understand the true nature of the contract until it was too late, until he was already enmeshed in the troop's closed world, his identity already being reshaped, his body already being groomed for the stage and for the bedchambers of wealthy men. This was the free market at its most brutal, where a child's beauty and vulnerability were raw materials to be purchased cheaply and sold at a premium. Once acquired, the boy entered a period of intense indoctrination, a systematic process of breaking down his former self and reforging him into a tool of the institution that now owned him. For the I.C. Oglin, this began the moment he passed through the gates of the Topkapi Palace. He was stripped of his old clothes, his head was shaved, he was ritually washed, and he was given a new Muslim name. This was a symbolic rebirth, a violent erasure of his past. The Enderun School was a world of rigid hierarchy and absolute discipline. The boys were organized into chambers, or odas, each with a specific curriculum and overseen by a white eunuch, known as an aga. The pedagogy was a strange and potent mixture of high intellectual pursuit and profound psychological manipulation. The boys learned to read and write Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. They studied theology, law, mathematics, and geography. They were trained in the arts of calligraphy, miniature painting, and music, becoming masters of the lute or the ney flute. They were also rigorously trained in military skills, archery, horsemanship, and wrestling. This was the official curriculum, designed to produce a well-rounded, capable, and cultured administrator. But beneath it was the unofficial curriculum, the one that truly mattered, the art of survival within a totalitarian microcosm. The boys learned that their advancement depended not just on merit, but on attracting the favor of their superiors. This meant absolute obedience, a talent for flattery, and an almost telepathic ability to anticipate the desires of the agas and older pages. Silence and observation were key survival skills. A misplaced word, a defiant glance, could result in a brutal beating with the falaka, a rod applied to the soles of the feet. This constant threat of physical pain was coupled with the promise of reward. A favored boy might receive better food, finer clothes, or lighter duties. The ultimate prize was attracting the notice of the Sultan himself. To be chosen as a personal page, a Hazo-Dali, was to reach the pinnacle of the Enderun system. It meant intimate access to the center of all power, a position of immense trust and influence. This path to favor was often, and explicitly, sexual. The boy's submission was the ultimate proof of his loyalty, his complete surrender to the will of his master. The system created a climate of intense competition, jealousy, and paranoia. Friendships were dangerous, alliances were temporary, and every other boy was a rival for the scarce resource of patronage. It was an education in a very specific type of courtly ruthlessness, a psychological crucible that burned away empathy and forged a hardened, ambitious, and utterly dependent servant of the throne. The indoctrination of the Cossack was less formal, but no less brutal. His training ground was not a palace school, but the back room of a tavern or the cramped quarters shared by the troop. The Kalbasi was his absolute master, a figure who combined the roles of teacher, father, and tyrant. The physical training was grueling. From dawn until dusk, the boy would practice, his body pushed to the limits of its flexibility and endurance. He would be forced to hold difficult poses for hours, to spin until he was dizzy and nauseous, to perfect the subtle, erotic tremor of the shoulders and hips that was the hallmark of the dance. His muscles would ache, his feet would bleed, but any complaint would be met with a slap or the sting of a whip. The goal was to break the body's natural resistance and remold it into an instrument of perfect, pliant grace. Parallel to this physical conditioning was a psychological grooming. The boy was taught to see his own body as his only asset. He was constantly praised for his beauty, his effeminacy, his ability to mimic female mannerisms. He was dressed in the troop's feminized costumes. His hair was tended to with obsessive care, and his face was painted for performances. This constant reinforcement of a manufactured, sexualized identity served to blur the lines between his true self and the persona he was forced to adopt. He was taught to flirt with his eyes, to use his smile as a tool, to respond to the drunken advances of patrons with a calculated coyness. The Kalbasi would instruct him on the specifics of pleasing clients, normalizing the idea that his body was a commodity to be used for the troops' profit. Isolation was a key tool of control. The boys of the Cole lived and worked together, rarely interacting with the outside world. Their only reality was the troop, their only authority the Kalbasi. This created an intense, insular environment where the grotesque became normal. The older boys, already victims of the system, would often help to indoctrinate the new arrivals, perpetuating the cycle of abuse. Any sense of personal shame or violation was systematically dismantled and replaced with a professional pragmatism. This was their job, their life. To resist was to starve. This relentless process stripped the boys of their childhood, their autonomy, and their sense of self-worth, leaving them with only a hollowed-out, performing shell, exquisitely trained for its own degradation. The daily life of an IC Oglin was a study in profound contradiction, a disorienting blend of luxurious confinement and psychological terror. He lived within the most opulent square mile on Earth, surrounded by breathtaking beauty. He ate from porcelain dishes, slept on silken sheets, and wore clothes woven with silver thread. He walked through courtyards filled with the scent of roses and the sound of fountains. Yet, this beauty was a cage, and its gilded bars were polished with fear. His schedule was rigidly controlled from the moment he woke before dawn to the moment he collapsed into an exhausted sleep. Every hour was accounted for. Prayers, lessons, physical training, and the performance of his specific duties. These duties varied depending on his rank and chamber. Junior pages might be responsible for menial tasks like cleaning or serving food. More senior pages were entrusted with guarding the Sultan's chambers, caring for his personal wardrobe, or even reading him to sleep. The most elite, the Haz-o-Dalalar, had duties that were intensely personal. One might be the Sultan's cupbearer, another his sword-bearer, another responsible for his turban. The keeper of the pitcher and ewer, for example, was responsible for the Sultan's ritual ablutions, a position of almost unimaginable intimacy and trust. Every one of these tasks, no matter how trivial it seemed, was a test. A spilled drop of water, a misplaced garment, a moment of inattention could be interpreted as incompetence or, far worse, as a sign of disloyalty. The pressure was immense and unceasing. The silence of the inner palace was itself a weapon. It amplified every footstep, every whisper, every rustle of silk. The boys learned to communicate through subtle glances and gestures, to read the mood of an aga from the slightest change in his expression. They were in a constant state of hypervigilance, aware that they were always being watched, always being judged, not only by their masters but by their rivals. The air was thick with intrigue. Factions constantly formed and dissolved among the pages, aligning with different viziers or with the powerful women of the harem. An IC Oglin might be used as a pawn, forced to carry secret messages or act as a spy, knowing that discovery meant certain death. His existence was a tightrope walk over a pit of vipers. He had access to the secrets of the empire, but he was a prisoner within its heart, his life utterly dependent on maintaining the favor of a single, all-powerful man who held the power of life and death in his hands. In stark contrast to the silent, perfumed terror of the palace, the daily life of the Cossack was a maelstrom of noise, sweat, and public degradation. His world was the Mayhane, a space thick with the fumes of cheap wine, raki, and hashish smoke. It was a world of raucous male energy, of loud laughter, drunken arguments, and the constant, leering gaze of patrons. His working day began long after the sun went down. For hours, he and his troupe would perform on a small, raised platform, the frantic, pounding rhythm of the accompanying musicians driving them to the point of exhaustion. The dance itself was an athletic feat, but it was the eroticism that sold. The patrons would roar their approval, throwing coins at the feet of their favorites, sometimes getting up to dance clumsily alongside them, grabbing at their clothes, their bodies. The Cossack had to navigate this chaos with a professional smile, appearing alluring but just out of reach, fending off the most aggressive advances without offending a paying customer. He was both the center of attention and completely powerless. Between sets, he would be expected to serve drinks, to sit with patrons, to endure their drunken caresses and crude propositions. His value was directly tied to his ability to generate excitement and revenue. The competition between troops and between dancers within a troupe was fierce. A dancer who lost his popularity, who failed to draw the admiration of the crowd, was a liability to the Kolbasi and would be punished or cast out. The physical toll was immense. The constant dancing led to injuries, the late nights, and poor nutrition to sickness. But it was the psychological toll that was most devastating. The Cossack learned to compartmentalize, to separate the smiling, seductive performer on the stage from the terrified child within. He became an expert at feigning pleasure, at manufacturing an air of joyful abandon while his spirit was being systematically crushed. The end of the performance did not mean the end of his duties. This was when the real business of the night often began. He would be sold to the highest bidder for the rest of the night, led away to a private room, or to the patron's home. There, in the quiet aftermath of the chaotic performance, the pretense would drop and the grim reality of his servitude would be laid bare. His body, which had been an instrument of art just hours before, became nothing more than a piece of property, used and discarded at the whim of the man who had bought him for the night. The psychological devastation wrought by these systems was profound and multifaceted, leaving scars that no amount of future success or escape could ever truly heal. For the I.C. Oglin in the Enderun School, the trauma was woven into the very fabric of his ambition. He was indoctrinated into a worldview where power and abuse were inextricably linked. To rise, he had to submit. To command, he first had to obey in the most debasing ways. This created a pathological cycle. The boy who was abused by an older page or an aga learned that this was the currency of power. When he himself gained seniority, he was likely to perpetrate the same abuse on the younger boys beneath him, not necessarily out of pure malice, but because it was the only model of authority he knew. It was how the system self-perpetuated. Many developed a form of Stockholm Syndrome, identifying so completely with their powerful oppressors that they internalized their values. The Sultan was not a tyrant, but a father figure. The brutal discipline was not abuse, but a necessary forging of character. This psychological defense mechanism was essential for survival, but it came at the cost of their authentic self. Competition was a corrosive acid on the soul. Friendships were a liability. Trust was a weakness. The constant need to be better, more beautiful, more favored than the boy standing next to him created a state of deep and abiding loneliness, an isolation that persisted even when surrounded by hundreds of others. Some boys undoubtedly broke under the pressure, succumbing to madness or despair, their fates unrecorded, a silent testament to the system's failures. For those who survived and graduated to positions of immense power, as grand viziers, provincial governors, or generals, the psychological damage was exported to the empire at large. They became men who understood power not as a responsibility, but as a privilege of the strong over the weak, men for whom cruelty was a legitimate tool of statecraft, and for whom empathy was a dangerous flaw. The Enderun School did not just create administrators, it created generations of highly capable, deeply damaged rulers. For the Kosek, the psychological impact was one of utter dehumanization. While the I.C. Oglin was being built into a pillar of the state, the Kosek was being ground down into a disposable commodity. His trauma was not gilded with the promise of future power. It was raw, public, and relentless. He learned from a tender age that his worth was located entirely in his physical appearance and his ability to arouse desire in others. This led to a profound and painful split between his inner self and his performing persona. He had to project an image of vibrant, available, and even joyful sexuality, while internally he was grappling with fear, disgust, and shame. This constant performance was emotionally exhausting and deeply alienating. Many Cossacks developed a hardened, cynical exterior as a defense mechanism, a veneer of indifference to protect the fragile remnant of their true selves. The public nature of their exploitation was uniquely damaging. They were not abused in the silent secrecy of a palace. They were degraded in the open, under the drunken gaze of dozens of men. This public spectacle stripped them of their dignity and marked them socially. While their performances were celebrated, the dancers themselves were often viewed with contempt, seen as belonging to a low, immoral class. They were desired but not respected, objects of lust but not of affection. Substance abuse was rampant and often encouraged. The Kalbasi might give the boys wine or hashish to lower their inhibitions, to numb their fear, and to make them more compliant. This often led to lifelong addiction, a chemical crutch to cope with a reality that was otherwise unbearable. The cycle of abuse was vicious. A Cossack who survived into his late teens or early 20s, his youthful, feminine beauty fading, faced a terrifying future. If he was lucky, he might become a musician in a troupe or a tavern keeper. If he was shrewd and ruthless enough, he might become a Kalbasi himself, perpetuating the very system that had destroyed his own childhood. For most, however, the end of their career meant being cast aside, with no money, no other skills, and a body broken by years of dancing and abuse. They were living ghosts, haunting the edges of the society that had once toasted their beauty, a stark reminder of the disposable nature of their lives. The end of service for an IC Oglin marked not an escape, but a graduation into the elite of the very system that had forged him. This moment, known as the Sikma, or going out, was a formal, celebrated transition. After years of servitude and education within the palace walls, the pages who had reached the highest echelons of the Enderon were appointed to powerful administrative or military posts throughout the empire. This was the system's ultimate success, the transformation of a foreign-born Christian slave boy into a loyal member of the Ottoman ruling class. A top graduate might be appointed governor of a major province like Egypt or Damascus. He might be made an aga of the Janissaries, a commander in the navy, or even, for the most favored and capable, the Grand Vizier, the second most powerful man in the empire. To cement his loyalty and integrate him fully into the Ottoman elite, he was often given a wife from the highest echelons of society. Frequently, this would be a sister, daughter, or niece of the Sultan himself, a princess from the imperial harem. This marriage was not a romantic affair. It was a political merger, binding the newly appointed official directly to the imperial dynasty through blood. He was no longer just a slave of the Sultan. He was family. He was now a pasha, a man of immense wealth and power, with a palace of his own and slaves to serve him. This dramatic reversal of fortune was the ultimate justification for the brutality of the Enderon. It created a powerful myth of meritocracy, suggesting that any boy, regardless of his origins, could rise to the very top. But it was a meritocracy built on a foundation of abuse. And these men, now in positions of authority, carried the psychological DNA of the Enderon with them. They governed as they had been governed, with a firm belief in absolute authority, a readiness to use violence to enforce discipline, and a deep-seated understanding of the intricate dance of patronage and intrigue. They had not escaped the system. They had become its new masters, its most effective and loyal gatekeepers. For the Cossack, the end of service was not a celebrated graduation, but a brutal, unceremonious slide into obsolescence. His entire value was predicated on a specific and fleeting aesthetic, youthful, androgynous beauty. The first shadow of a beard, the deepening of his voice, the hardening of his features into those of a man. These were not signs of maturation, but the death knell of his career. Typically by his early 20s, and often much sooner, a Cossack was considered over the hill his patrons, forever seeking the thrill of the new and the taboo of the barely post-pubescent, would turn their attention and their coins to the younger boys in the troop. The Kalbasi, a pragmatist above all else, would see him as a depreciating asset. His place on the stage would be given to a new recruit, a prettier, younger version of what he once was. The fate that awaited these discarded dancers was almost universally grim. They were turned out with little or no money, their years of earnings having been mostly pocketed by the troop leader. They possessed no other skills. Their education had been in seduction and dance, arts that had no value once their primary instrument. Their youthful body had failed them. Many were physically broken, suffering from chronic injuries, ailments from poor living conditions, and the long-term effects of alcohol or drug dependency. They were also social outcasts. Their profession had marked them, making it difficult to find respectable work or to marry and have a family. Some managed to cling to the periphery of the world that had consumed them. They might find work as musicians, their calloused fingers now plucking a lute instead of clicking cymbals. They might become cooks or waiters in the very taverns where they once danced. A small, particularly ruthless few, as mentioned, managed to claw their way up to become Kalbasi themselves, thus completing the tragic circle by inflicting upon a new generation the same suffering they had endured. But for the vast majority, the future was one of poverty, beggary, and an early death. They were the human refuse of a voracious entertainment industry, used up and thrown away, their brief, glittering careers a prelude to a long, dark oblivion. It would be a profound injustice to the memory of these boys to portray them solely as passive victims. Within these crushingly oppressive systems, they were not merely lumps of clay being molded by their masters. They were human beings, and they found ways, both subtle and overt, to exercise agency, to resist, and to fight back. The very structure that was meant to ensure the I.C. Oglin's loyalty also gave him opportunities for defiance. The palace was a nest of conspiracies, and the pages were its eyes and ears. And I.C. Oglin, privy to the most intimate conversations and secrets of the state, was a valuable asset to any faction. While outright rebellion was suicidal, covert resistance was a constant undercurrent. A page loyal to a particular vizier might subtly sabotage a rival by misplacing an important document or mishearing a critical order. He might act as a conduit for secret messages between a prince plotting against his brother and his supporters in the capital. This was an incredibly dangerous game. The line between being a player and a pawn was razor thin, and a single miscalculation would lead to a silent, swift execution, often by the bowstring, a death reserved for high-ranking officials to avoid the spilling of noble blood. Others resisted in more personal ways. They might feign illness to avoid unwanted attentions, or use their intelligence to play their abusers off against one another. The very ambition that the system was designed to foster could become a form of resistance, as a page focused all his energy on academic and martial excellence as a way to transcend his role as a mere object of desire and become indispensable based on his skills alone. These acts of defiance were not grand gestures of revolution, but they were a powerful testament to the refusal of the human spirit to be completely extinguished, a desperate attempt to carve out a sliver of autonomy in a world designed to deny it. The resistance of the Cossacks was often more desperate and more violent. Their public-facing role and their congregation in troops gave them a different set of tools for defiance. The troops themselves, the Kol, often functioned as more than just dance companies. They became tight-knit, secretive brotherhoods, almost like street gangs or proto-mafias. They developed their own slang, their own codes of conduct, and their own methods of enforcing justice in a world where the official legal system offered them no protection. A patron who was particularly cruel or who refused to pay might find himself ambushed in a dark alley by the dancers' troopmates, beaten and robbed. These troops would battle each other for territory, for control of the most lucrative taverns and coffee houses, in violent brawls that sometimes spilled out into the streets. Individual acts of defiance could be even more dramatic. There are historical accounts, often embellished into legend, of Cossacks who, pushed beyond the brink of endurance, murdered their abusers. A famous story tells of a dancer who, after being brutalized by a powerful Janissary officer, stabbed his tormentor to death in his sleep. Such an act was, of course, a death sentence. The dancer would be hunted down and subjected to a gruesome public execution, perhaps impaled or tortured to death as a warning to others. But in that one final act of violence, he reclaimed his agency, refusing to be a victim any longer and choosing death on his own terms. Suicide was another tragic form of resistance, the ultimate escape from an unbearable reality. For a boy trapped in a cycle of relentless abuse, with no hope for the future, taking his own life could be seen as the last and only act of control he had left over his own body. Even more subtle was the resistance in performance itself. The deliberate introduction of satirical or subversive gestures, a flicker of contempt in the eyes that only a knowing audience might understand, using the art form itself to mock the very patrons who paid for it. The retribution for any form of resistance, especially organized resistance, was predictably swift and mercilessly brutal. The Ottoman state and the social structures it supported relied on the absolute submission of its subjects, and any challenge to that authority had to be crushed in the most spectacular and terrifying way possible. The goal was not simply to punish the transgressor, but to stage a piece of political theater, a horrific performance designed to terrorize anyone else who might contemplate defiance. An I.C. Oglin caught in a palace conspiracy would not simply be killed. He would be made an example of. He might be tortured in the palace dungeons to extract the names of his co-conspirators. The methods were medieval in their cruelty: the rack, the bastinado, the application of hot irons. His execution would be symbolic. Being sewn into a weighted sack and thrown into the deep, cold currents of the Bosphorus was a common fate for those who had betrayed the palace's secrets. It was a silent, anonymous death, erasing the traitor from existence without the messiness of a public execution. This method served a dual purpose. It eliminated the threat, and it sent a chilling message to every other page in the palace. Your life is a gift from the Sultan, and it can be taken away silently and completely at any moment. Your grave will be the water, and no one will ever know what became of you. For a Cossack who dared to raise a hand against a patron, the punishment was public, visceral, and designed to reinforce the social hierarchy. He would be paraded through the streets, subjected to the jeers and projectiles of the crowd, before being brought to a public square for execution. Impalement was a particularly gruesome method used for crime scene as a challenge to social order. It was a slow, agonizing death, with the victim left on display for days as a rotting warning. The spectacle reinforced the idea that the life of a low-status performer was worthless compared to that of his social superiors. Even the troops that engaged in gang-like warfare were periodically and brutally suppressed. The authorities would raid the taverns, rounding up dozens of dancers, executing the ringleaders, and flogging the rest. These crackdowns served to remind the Cossacks of their precarious place in the social order. They were permitted to exist for the pleasure of the elite, but they would never be allowed to accumulate any real power of their own. The system's response to resistance was always disproportionate, a sledgehammer to crack a nut. This pathological overreaction was a symptom of its inherent insecurity. A system built on such profound exploitation is fragile, and it must rely on terror to maintain its facade of stability. Every act of retribution was a reaffirmation of the fundamental rule: the powerless must remain powerless, and their bodies and souls are the property of the strong. No system, however entrenched, is eternal. The institutions of the I.C. Oglin and the Cossack, which had seemed like immutable features of the Ottoman landscape for centuries, began to wither and decline in the face of profound social, military, and political transformations. The decline of the Devserm system, and with it the Inderun school in its classical form, was a slow process driven by internal decay and shifting power dynamics. By the 17th century, the Janissary Corps, once the Sultan's loyal slave soldiers, had become a powerful and seditious Praetorian Guard, a state within a state. They began to demand the right to enroll their own sons into the Corps, diluting the pool of foreign-born recruits and undermining the core logic of the Devserm. The levy became less frequent and eventually ceased altogether. Simultaneously, Turkish noble families, long excluded from the highest offices of state, began to reassert their influence, chipping away at the power of the slave elite produced by the Inderun. While the palace school continued to exist, its function changed. It became less of a crucible for forging rootless administrators and more of a finishing school for the sons of the Turkish elite, losing its unique and brutal character. The sexual exploitation within the palace likely continued, but the vast, state-run bureaucratic system for procuring and processing thousands of foreign boys faded into history. The demise of the Cossack tradition was more abrupt and was a direct result of the dramatic political and social reforms of the 19th century. The critical turning point was the auspicious incident of 1826, when Sultan Mahmud II, in a bloody and decisive move to centralize his own power, destroyed the Janissary Corps. With this one act, the Cossacks lost their most powerful, most numerous, and most dangerously obsessive patrons. The Janissary barracks had been the heart of Cossack culture, and their destruction ripped that heart out. This military reform was part of a much broader movement known as the Tanzimat, a period of intense modernization and westernization. Ottoman leaders, acutely aware of their empire's lagging power relative to Europe, sought to remake their state and their society in a European image. They reformed the military, the bureaucracy, the legal system, and they also turned a critical eye on social customs that were seen as backward or degenerate by European visitors. The public performance of boy dancers, openly available for sexual hire, was a source of considerable embarrassment to the reform-minded Ottoman elite. It flew in the face of the Victorian morality they were trying to emulate. Consequently, the practice was officially suppressed. Sultan Abdülmecit formal banet küçükdancing. While the practice undoubtedly continued in secret, driven underground into private clubs and back-alley taverns, its time as a celebrated, mainstream feature of Ottoman public life was over. The combined forces of military upheaval and a conscious effort to project a more modern national image had rendered the Cossack an anachronism, a colorful but shameful relic of a past the new Turkey was trying to leave behind. And so we are left with the echoes and the silence. The stories of these boys, the icy Oglin in his gilded cage and the Cossack on his squalid stage, are a harrowing testament to the boundless capacity of systems, both stately and social, to commodify and consume human life. They endured a torment that was physical, psychological, and spiritual, their childhoods sacrificed at the altar of imperial stability or public amusement. Their bodies were made into instruments of power and pleasure, their minds reshaped by a brutal calculus of survival, and their souls scarred by a hypocrisy that celebrated their beauty while destroying their humanity. They were trapped in a paradox, desired but despised, elevated but enslaved. The I.C. Oglin might graduate to become a pasha, draped in sable and authority, but that authority was built upon the foundations of his own violation, a trauma he would then perpetuate. The Cossack might be showered with coins and applause, but that applause was the soundtrack to his degradation, a fleeting moment of glory before being cast into the darkness of obsolescence. The moral lesson that reverberates from these forgotten histories is not merely that cruelty existed in the past. It is a far more specific and cautionary tale. It is about the terrifying power of institutionalization, when abuse is not just an individual act, but is sanctioned and structured by the state or woven into the very fabric of a society's culture. It becomes exponentially more monstrous. The laws, the customs, the art, the entire social apparatus can be marshaled to normalize the grotesque, to disguise exploitation as tradition, and to silence the victims by denying them the very language to name their own suffering. The story of the I.C. Oglin and the Cossack is a stark reminder that the greatest atrocities are often committed not in fits of passion, but through the cold, methodical workings of a system that people accept, participate in, and benefit from. It is a warning against the seductive power of the gilded cage, the temptation to accept comfort and security at the price of one's own, or another's, fundamental human dignity. Today, we live in a world that has, in principle, enshrined the rights of the child and the inherent worth of every individual in international law. These are radical, historically recent ideas, won through centuries of struggle. Remembering the silent, systematic suffering of the boys of the Ottoman Empire is not an act of morbid curiosity. It is an act of profound gratitude for these hard-won rights. It is a solemn duty to bear witness, to listen for the faint, desperate cries that were swallowed by the marble walls of the palace and the cheap wine of the taverns. We must remember them, not just as victims, but as boys who resisted, who survived, who endured, and whose stories form a crucial, if deeply dark, chapter in the endless struggle for justice. Their memory challenges us to remain vigilant, to recognize that the machinery of exploitation is endlessly inventive, and to ask ourselves what silent suffering in our own time will future generations struggle to comprehend.